All right, mi gente, what's up? You guys have been asking for it, so this episode's going to be all about Bernie Sanders' Sunday night interview on 60 Minutes where he defended his former praise of Fidel Castro, and he said that everything about the Cuban Revolution is not all bad. That was his quote there. And so, although this is incredibly difficult to do, I'm going to try to break these comments that he made up into two parts because one is really subjective and the other is objective and can be assessed more objectively. The first thing we have is Bernie Sanders' praise for Fidel Castro. He went on to tell Anderson Cooper in the interview that he does not support murderous dictators like Kim Jong-un and that Putin is not a friend. But he did not say these things about Fidel. It's known that he really admires Fidel, idolizes Fidel. And, again, this is the subjective part, but here's my opinion on it. I think that any support for an authoritarian, narcissistic dictator like Fidel Castro is completely reprehensible. This is a guy who murdered innocent people, fusilaban a la gente after it was revolutionary justice, and they would line them up, firing squads would shoot people. This was a guy that really only cared about himself and wanted to just plunder Cuba. There's countless human rights abuses, thousands of other dissidents jailed. He reneged on so many promises. He withheld free elections. So if you're praising this guy number one, this is as a Democratic presidential candidate, this is completely disrespectful to the 1.5 million Cubans that live in Florida, which is a state that you're trying to win. And so it just looks bad. And honestly, I think it's reprehensible. And again, this is the subjective part. So it sounds repetitive, but there's really not much that I can say here. The other part is that he defended the social merits of the Cuban Revolution. So this ties into another theme that I write about frequently, which is that the fruits of the Cuban Revolution are rotten. Because a lot of people say the fruits of the revolution, I say they're rotten. This does not deny that they exist. They do exist, but they are rotten. And they are rotten because they no longer serve the people that they were intended to serve. So, the revolution, what a lot of people don't understand is that it was a very popular movement. Corruption was rampant in Cuba under Batista in the years leading up to 1959. This guy was in bed with both the US government and the mafia. And unless you were benefiting directly from the corruption, you really wanted a change. And so the revolution was a very popular movement. I've been analyzing this from this perspective lately, where because of its absolutist nature, it's created these now limited perspectives and sort of official narratives where, people say there was no need for a revolution. Cuba was the best thing in the world. But you know what? It really did have its problems. And so in the mountains of the Sierra Maestra, the rebels created this document called the Sierra Manifesto. And that was to many people believe that was to serve as their platform once the revolution succeeded. And it was very, very progressive at its time, widely supported. So the policies that these people put down on paper got mass support. The problem is that once Castro took power, it was his playground, and that document was basically thrown out the window. And so let's talk about some of the things that actually happened and some of the things that Bernie Sanders defended. Bernie Sanders defended free education and free healthcare among the laurels of the revolution that, those are the bright spots in it, he said. And yeah, that's all fine and good. But when you look at it, I don't even want to get bogged down in the details of how Cuba's literacy rate was pretty high compared to a lot of other countries before the revolution, and then how it was almost 100% after, or how Castro could have used he shut down private schools, and a lot of people say that he used the literacy campaign just as a tool to brainwash people because that came with a lot of revolutionary education, and so it was a little one-sided in that way. But just to get beyond all that, I wrote an article called Havana versus La Habana, of the two realities that exist within Cuba. And it's where I first talk about the fruits of the Cuban Revolution being rotten. What I mean is that these fruits are not serving the people anymore. So basically, what's the point of having a population that is very well educated and everybody has free, albeit very poor quality healthcare? Because when it's free, the quality is going to suffer. Price goes down, quality suffers. So you have a very smart, very educated population. Cuba is excellent at developing human capital and then exporting that human capital overseas. They do nothing to keep the capital there. They create a smart population, an educated population, a healthy population, and then neither of those things translate to a higher standard of living. So why are we even getting bogged down in these details? With education, you can't really earn a decent wage in Cuba unless you work within the private sector, and that's very small. And that is not very tied to education. You know, you're better off being a barber or a taxi driver as opposed to a doctor, because then you're making more than as a doctor who's making about 25 bucks a month, like maybe max, you know? And with the theme of doctors, look, there's not enough doctors per capita in Cuba for the Cuban people. They're using Soviet era tools and machinery. Yes, they do a lot of research and they educate their doctors well, and then they export them abroad to promote their international image. So, you know, Cuban people are suffering because doctors are stealing from their practices, selling things on the black market. They're not showing up to work because they're getting paid either way. The quality is going down. They have very old tools and equipment. And so the quality is bad. Nothing translates to a higher standard of living. And isn't that what we're talking about here? Isn't that the point? Who cares if you can read, if you can't put food on the table for your family? And so, on the one hand, just to recap, Bernie's defense of Fidel Castro, morally reprehensible, terrible, in my opinion, horrible for if you're trying to win Florida, where the Cuban exile community largely lives. Secondly, is this theme of not everything about the Cuban Revolution was all bad, mainly healthcare and education. My opinion there, the fruits of the revolution exist, but they're rotten.